The veteran's unexpected encounter. John Carter's hands trembled as he adjusted the rearview mirror of his weathered pickup truck. The golden sun cast long shadows across the sleepy southern town, painting the streets with a nostalgic hue. For a man who had served his country with honor, these streets held memories of both pride and pain. Today, they would bring him face to face with a test of character he hadn't expected. The old truck's door creaked open, and John stepped out, his tall, broad-shouldered frame silhouetted against the fading light. His joints ached from years of service, but his spirit remained unbroken. Dressed in a simple plaid shirt and worn jeans, he looked every bit the humble veteran. His destination was Tom's Diner, a place he'd frequented for decades. It was his haven, where the smell of fresh coffee and the warmth of familiar faces made him feel at home. As he approached, the clinking of utensils and muted laughter spilled out from the diner's doors. The sight of the faded sign overhead brought a small smile to his lips. This was a routine he cherished: a slice of pie, a hot cup of coffee, and the comforting hum of community chatter. Pushing open the door, John was greeted by the familiar jingle of the bells above. Yet, something was off. The usual cheerful atmosphere was replaced by an uneasy silence. Conversations halted mid-sentence, and every eye turned toward him. The sense of welcome he had always felt seemed to evaporate. John hesitated, his smile faltering. For a moment, his instincts, honed through years of service, told him something wasn't right. He shook off the unease, chalking it up to his imagination, and made his way to the counter. As he passed, he nodded politely to familiar faces, but the responses were muted, with some patrons averting their gazes. Tom Harris, the owner of the diner, emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a towel. Normally, Tom's face bore a jovial expression, but today his features were hardened, his jaw set tight. His eyes met John's with a coldness that sent a shiver down the veteran's spine. "Afternoon, Tom," John greeted warmly, taking his usual seat at the counter. "Just the usual. A slice of your famous apple pie and a coffee." Tom didn't respond immediately. He folded the towel in his hands, his movements deliberate, as if he were stalling. When he finally spoke, his voice was devoid of its usual friendliness. "I'm afraid we're out of pie today, John." John frowned, glancing toward the counter where a fresh apple pie sat under the glass display. "I can see a pie right there, Tom." "We're closed early today," Tom interrupted, his tone sharp. "You'll have to leave." The words hit John like a physical blow. He stared at Tom, searching for an explanation, but the diner owner's cold expression remained unyielding. "Tom," John began cautiously, "have I done something to upset you?" Tom's face darkened, his voice rising. "You've done plenty just by walking in here. I don't serve your kind. Now get out before I have to call someone to remove you." A hushed gasp rippled through the diner. John froze, his breath catching in his throat. The weight of those words brought back memories he tried to bury. Memories of doors slammed in his face, of segregated water fountains, of being treated as less than human, despite fighting for his country. But this wasn't just any stranger. This was Tom, a man he'd known for years. "I see," John said quietly, his voice steady despite the sting of humiliation. Rising from his seat, he adjusted the brim of his hat and looked around at the other patrons. Most avoided his gaze, their faces etched with discomfort or indifference. Only a young woman near the corner stood, her voice trembling with indignation. "This isn't right," she exclaimed, glaring at Tom. "You can't treat him like this." Tom rounded on her, his voice laced with anger. "This is my diner, and I'll run it as I see fit. If you don't like it, you can leave too." The young woman faltered, her courage wavering under Tom's glare. She sat back down, her head bowed in defeat. John turned toward the door, his shoulders slumped. He didn't argue or protest. He simply walked away, the familiar jingle of the bells marking his exit. Outside, John leaned against his truck, his hands trembling as he fumbled for his keys. The bright sunlight now felt oppressive, a harsh spotlight on the injustice he'd just endured. He climbed into the driver's seat and gripped the wheel, his knuckles white. Memories of the past came rushing back, marches for civil rights, the sting of tear gas, and the hope he'd carried that things would change. He thought the world had moved forward, but moments like this reminded him how much work remained. John's jaw tightened. He wasn't the kind of man to seek revenge or wallow in self-pity, but he also wasn't a man to let injustice stand unchallenged. Taking a deep breath, he started the engine. He didn't know exactly what he would do yet, but one thing was certain: this wasn't over. As he drove away, the quiet streets of the town seemed to mock him with their stillness. Inside the diner, Tom Harris stood behind the counter, his hands trembling as he poured coffee. The whispers and stares of his remaining customers gnawed at him, but he ignored them, convincing himself he'd done the right thing. Little did Tom know, the repercussions of his actions would soon ripple far beyond his small diner. The man he had humiliated wasn't just any veteran. He was John Carter, and the legacy he carried was far more influential than anyone in that diner could have imagined. Seeds of change. John Carter drove home in silence, the rhythmic hum of his truck's engine the only sound accompanying his heavy thoughts. He gripped the wheel tighter than necessary, his jaw set with determination. The humiliation he'd faced at Tom's diner was a stark reminder of the battles he thought he'd left behind. This wasn't just about him. It was about every veteran, every person of color, and every marginalized individual who had faced similar prejudice. Pulling into his driveway, John turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, staring at the modest house he called home for decades. Memories of his late wife, Margaret, flooded his mind, her voice echoing in his thoughts. Always take the high road, John. Show them who you are by your actions, not your anger. He sighed deeply, drawing strength from her words as he stepped out of the truck. Inside, the house was quiet except for the faint ticking of the old clock in the living room. John picked up the phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in months. After a few rings, a familiar voice answered. "Michael Carter," the voice said briskly. "Son," John began, his voice steady, but laced with a hint of weariness. "We need to talk." On the other end of the line, Michael's tone softened immediately. "Dad, is everything okay?" John hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Not exactly. Something happened today that, well, it can't go unanswered." Over the next few minutes, John recounted the events at Tom's diner, his voice calm but firm. Michael listened intently, his silence punctuated only by the occasional sharp intake of breath. By the time John finished, Michael's tone was measured but simmering with anger. "This is unacceptable," Michael said. "You've given so much to this country, and to be treated like that." "Dad, I'm coming home." John tried to protest. "Michael, I don't need you to drop everything for this. You've got important work in Washington." "You're important, Dad," Michael interrupted. "I'll be there tomorrow." John hung up the phone, a mixture of pride and worry swirling in his chest. Michael had always been a man of action, driven by a deep sense of justice. As a U.S. Senator, he wielded influence that could bring about real change, but John also knew how fiercely his son could fight when it came to protecting his family. The next morning, true to his word, Michael arrived the following morning, stepping out of a sleek black car that looked out of place on John's humble street. Dressed in a tailored suit, his polished shoes clicked against the pavement as he walked toward his father's house. Despite his professional appearance, the warm hug he gave John was a reminder of the boy who had once idolized his father's strength and integrity. Over coffee, the two men sat at the kitchen table, the morning sunlight streaming through the curtains. John recounted the events at the diner once more, sparing no detail. Michael listened with a stony expression, his fingers steepled as he processed his father's words. "I want to handle this carefully," Michael said finally. "Not just for you, but for everyone in this town. People like Tom Harris thrive on division. We need to respond in a way that unites, not alienates." John nodded. "I trust you, son. What do you have in mind?" Michael's lips curved into a small, determined smile. "It starts with making Tom Harris realize the true weight of his actions. But it doesn't end there. We're going to transform this town." Meanwhile, at Tom's diner, Tom Harris arrived at his diner that morning feeling a gnawing sense of unease. The previous day's events had left a bitter taste in his mouth, and the whispers of disapproval from his customers still rang in his ears. As he unlocked the door, he noticed a few passers-by giving him sidelong glances, their expressions a mix of curiosity and disdain. Inside, Tom tried to focus on his routine, but the atmosphere felt off. Regulars who normally greeted him with friendly banter were distant, their conversations hushed. Even his longtime waitress, Sarah, seemed unusually quiet as she went about her tasks. By midday, the diner was emptier than usual. Tom couldn't ignore the feeling that something had shifted in the town. People weren't just upset, they were staying away. His worst fears were confirmed when one of his oldest regulars, Mr. Jenkins, stopped by to pay his tab. "I won't be coming back for a while, Tom," Mr. Jenkins said, his tone heavy with disappointment. "What you did to John Carter, it wasn't right." Tom opened his mouth to argue, but the words caught in his throat. Mr. Jenkins shook his head and left, the sound of the bell above the door echoing ominously in the quiet diner. The plan in motion. Back at John's house, Michael was on the phone, speaking with community leaders, local activists, and even a few reporters. Word of what had happened at Tom's diner was spreading fast, and Michael knew how to use momentum to their advantage. He wasn't just planning to hold Tom accountable, he was laying the groundwork for something bigger. By late afternoon, Michael had assembled a coalition of supporters. Among them were veterans, civil rights advocates, and everyday citizens who were tired of the subtle prejudices that had lingered in their town for too long. Together, they began organizing a peaceful demonstration outside Tom's diner, one that would shine a light on the incident and demand accountability. The demonstration. The following morning, Tom arrived at his diner to find a crowd gathered outside. Men and women of all ages stood holding signs with messages like "Equality for All" and "No to Racism." At the center of the group stood John Carter, his presence commanding respect without a single word. Tom's heart sank as he pushed through the crowd to unlock the door. The faces of his former customers stared back at him, their expressions a mixture of disappointment and resolve. Once inside, Tom paced nervously, peeking out the window as the crowd grew larger. Around noon, the doors jingled, and in walked Michael Carter. Tom recognized him immediately. The resemblance to John was unmistakable, though Michael carried himself with an air of authority that was almost intimidating. "You must be Tom Harris," Michael said, his tone calm but firm. "I'm Michael Carter. I believe we have some things to discuss." Tom straightened, his pride surfacing despite the tension. "I don't know what you're hoping to accomplish here," he said gruffly. "This is my diner, and I have the right to run it as I see fit." Michael's expression didn't waver. "You're right, Mr. Harris. It is your diner. But that doesn't mean your actions are without consequences. My father served this country with honor, and your treatment of him was not only disrespectful, but also a violation of the values this community should stand for." Tom bristled but said nothing. Michael leaned forward, his voice lowering. "This isn't about ruining your business or tearing you down. It's about holding you accountable and helping this town move forward. You have a choice, Mr. Harris. You can dig in your heels, or you can take a step toward making things right." Tom stared at Michael, his mind racing. The weight of his actions, and the growing backlash, pressed down on him like a heavy stone. For the first time, doubt began to creep into his thoughts. Could he really justify his actions, even to himself? As Michael left the diner, he turned back briefly. "Think about it, Mr. Harris. Change is never easy, but it's always worth it." A town divided. That evening, the town was abuzz with conversations about the demonstration and Michael's visit to the diner. Some defended Tom, clinging to old prejudices and arguing that he had every right to refuse service. But many others, inspired by John's quiet dignity and Michael's impassioned leadership, began to question long-held beliefs. For Tom Harris, the weight of public scrutiny was becoming unbearable. His diner, once a bustling hub of activity, now sat mostly empty. Regular customers had vanished, and the few who remained cast wary glances in his direction. Alone in his office, Tom stared at the photograph of his late father that hung on the wall. His father had always been a staunch defender of tradition, but as Tom reflected on the past few days, he couldn't help but wonder if some traditions were worth letting go. The seeds of change had been planted, but the journey was far from over. The small southern town was on the brink of a transformation that would test its people's values and challenge them to confront the biases they had long ignored. For John and Michael Carter, the fight was just beginning. For Tom Harris, a crossroads lay ahead, one that would determine not only his future but the legacy he left behind. The turning point. Tom Harris sat at the counter of his diner long after closing, the neon open sign extinguished and the blinds drawn. The once bustling space now felt like a ghost of its former self. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the refrigeration units and the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards. On the counter lay the folded newspaper that had been waiting for him that morning. The front page headline read, "Veteran Shunned by Local Diner Sparks Townwide Movement." Beneath the headline was a photo of John Carter standing among a diverse group of supporters outside the diner. His stoic expression radiated strength and dignity. Tom couldn't tear his eyes from the article. The words seemed to leap off the page, each one a dagger to his pride. Phrases like blatant prejudice and long-standing biases in the community stung the most. He thought he had been standing up for his values, for his father's legacy, but now he wasn't so sure. He reached for the glass of whiskey he poured earlier, his hands trembling slightly. The taste was bitter, like the realization gnawing at him. He was the villain in his own story. For years, he had prided himself on being a pillar of the community, a man who upheld tradition and order. But now, that image was crumbling, a visit from the past. The next morning, Tom was startled awake by the loud knock at his front door. He shuffled to answer, still groggy and unshaven. On his porch stood an older woman he hadn't seen in years, Mrs. Eleanor Jenkins, one of his late father's closest friends. "Eleanor," he said, blinking in surprise, "what brings you here?" Eleanor stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, her cane tapping against the wooden floor. "I came to talk some sense into you," she said bluntly, her voice sharp despite her age. "I've heard all about what happened, and I can't keep quiet any longer." Tom frowned, closing the door behind her. "With all due respect, Eleanor, this is my business. I don't need anyone telling me how to run it." Eleanor turned to face him, her piercing blue eyes boring into his. "Your father was my friend, Tom, but let me tell you something. He wasn't a perfect man. He carried a lot of anger and pain, and he let it twist him into someone I hardly recognized by the end. Is that the legacy you want to carry forward?" Tom stiffened, but Eleanor pressed on. "Your father wasn't born prejudiced, you know. The war changed him. He lost friends, saw things no one should ever see. But instead of dealing with that pain, he let it fester. And now you're doing the same thing." For a moment, Tom didn't respond. He turned away, staring out the window at the empty street. "You don't understand," he muttered. "I've built my whole life around this diner. It's all I have left of him." Eleanor sighed, leaning on her cane. "Then honor him by making it better, Tom. Let go of the hatred. This town doesn't need another monument to the past. It needs hope for the future." Her words lingered long after she left, echoing in Tom's mind as he went about his day. For the first time, he began to question not just his actions, but the beliefs that had shaped them. John's proposal. While Tom wrestled with his doubts, John and Michael Carter were busy organizing the next phase of their plan. The demonstration had been a success, drawing attention from nearby towns and even a few regional news outlets. But Michael knew that public opinion alone wouldn't be enough to create lasting change. "We need to do more than make a statement," Michael said during a meeting with community leaders at his father's house. "We need to create something tangible, something that shows this town and the world that progress is possible." John listened quietly, his eyes thoughtful. Finally, he spoke. "What if we approached Tom directly? Offered him a way out?" The room fell silent as everyone considered the idea. Michael frowned. "You think he'd listen, Dad? He's been stubborn as a mule so far." John smiled faintly. "Maybe. But sometimes people just need a nudge in the right direction. And if he won't listen, well, we'll have to get creative." A new beginning. A week later, Tom was closing up the diner when John Carter walked through the door. The sight of the older man caught Tom off guard, and for a moment, he froze. "John," Tom said awkwardly, "we're closed." "I'm not here for coffee," John replied calmly. He walked to the counter and sat down, his movements deliberate. "I'm here to talk." Tom hesitated, then sighed and sat across from him. "If you're here to lecture me, save your breath." John chuckled softly. "I'm not here to lecture. I'm here to offer you a way forward." Tom's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" John reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "This is an offer to buy the diner," he said, sliding it across the counter. "It's fair, more than fair, actually. My son and I want to turn this place into something new. A community hub where people from all walks of life can come together." Tom stared at the paper, his jaw tightening. "You want me to sell? Just like that?" John nodded. "It's your choice, Tom. But think about it. This place has been struggling for years. You know that as well as I do. This is your chance to let go of the past and start fresh." Tom leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. Part of him wanted to throw the offer back in John's face, to cling to the diner out of sheer stubbornness. But another part, the part that had been growing louder since Eleanor's visit, told him to consider it. After a long silence, Tom spoke. "And what happens if I say no?" John's expression didn't change. "Then nothing changes, and this town will remember you as the man who chose pride over progress. A town on edge." Word of John's offer spread quickly, dividing the town even further. Some supported the idea, seeing it as a chance for healing and unity. Others bristled at the thought of the diner changing hands, clinging to their old ways and traditions. For Tom, the pressure was overwhelming. Everywhere he went, he was met with whispers and sideways glances. His once proud reputation was in shambles, and the weight of his father's legacy felt heavier than ever. As the days passed, Tom found himself standing in the middle of the empty diner, staring at the mural his father had painted years ago. It depicted a sunny farm scene, a symbol of simpler times. But now, all Tom could see were the cracks in the paint, the faded colors, a reminder that nothing lasted forever. He thought about Eleanor's words, about the crowd that had gathered outside his diner, about John Carter's quiet dignity. And for the first time, he wondered if letting go of the diner might be the best way to honor his father, not by clinging to the past, but by building a better future. The decision. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Tom picked up the phone and dialed John's number. When the older man answered, Tom's voice was steady but laced with emotion. "I've made my decision," he said. "Let's talk." The next day, Tom sat across from John and Michael at the diner, signing the paperwork that would officially transfer ownership. As he handed the pen back, he felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. "What are you going to do with the place?" Tom asked quietly. Michael smiled. "You'll see." The sale of Tom's diner marked the beginning of a new chapter, not just for Tom, but for the entire community. Over the next few weeks, the diner underwent a transformation, becoming a symbol of hope and unity. For Tom, it was the start of a personal journey that would challenge him to confront his past, redefine his beliefs, and find redemption in the most unexpected of ways. The community awakens, The diner was no longer Tom Harris's haven of nostalgia, nor was it the silent battlefield where John Carter had faced the sting of humiliation. As the weeks passed, the transformation of the space became a tangible reflection of the change stirring within the community. The peeling paint was stripped away, replaced by a fresh coat of warm colors that invited everyone in. The old, worn booths were replaced with polished wood tables, each adorned with a small vase of fresh flowers. But the most striking change was the large mural now adorning the back wall. It was an expansive piece of art that depicted the town's history, its struggles, triumphs, and moments of unity. At the center of the mural stood two figures. One resembled a younger John Carter, dressed in his military uniform, and the other, a white soldier, portrayed with the same youthful vigor. The two men stood shoulder to shoulder, their postures radiating strength and camaraderie. It was a tribute to both John Carter and Tom Harris Sr., an acknowledgement of their shared sacrifices and the potential for reconciliation. A quiet opening, a loud statement. The day of the diner's reopening dawned quietly, with little fanfare. Yet, as word spread that the Veterans Table was ready to welcome its first patrons, people began to gather outside. Families, veterans, and community leaders mingled on the sidewalk, their curiosity palpable. Inside, John Carter stood near the counter, his hands resting on the polished surface. Michael stood beside him, scrolling through his phone, ensuring everything was in place for the media coverage later that day. John glanced at his son, sensing the younger man's slight tension. "You're nervous," John said, a hint of amusement in his tone. Michael looked up, chuckling softly. "I'm not nervous, Dad. Just focused." John's eyes sparkled with quiet pride. "You've done good work here, son. Now let's see if it was worth it." The first patrons entered hesitantly, their eyes widening as they took in the changes. A young boy pointed to the mural, tugging at his mother's sleeve, while an older man in a faded military jacket ran his fingers over one of the display cases containing medals and memorabilia donated by local veterans. John greeted everyone with warmth, shaking hands and sharing stories. He made a point to approach Tom Harris, who stood near the doorway, looking unsure of his place in the room. "Glad you came, Tom," John said, extending his hand. Tom hesitated before shaking it. "I wasn't sure if I should." John smiled gently. "You're part of this, whether you realize it or not." A difficult conversation. Later that afternoon, as the crowd thinned, John and Tom found themselves sitting across from each other at one of the new tables. The atmosphere between them was heavy with unspoken words. Tom stared down at the steaming cup of coffee in front of him, his hands clasped tightly together. "I don't know where to begin," Tom admitted, his voice low. "I've spent weeks trying to figure out what to say to you, but nothing seems right." John sipped his coffee, his gaze steady. "The fact that you're here says plenty." Tom shook his head. "I've done a lot of thinking since everything happened. About my father, about what he taught me. I grew up believing his way was the only way, that the world was divided into us and them. But I see now how wrong that was." He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "I've hurt people, John. I hurt you, and I don't know if I can ever make up for that." John leaned forward, his expression softening. "Acknowledging it is the first step, Tom. None of us can change the past, but we can decide what kind of future we want to build. You've got the chance to do that now." Tom nodded slowly, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I want to do better." Ripples of change. The reopening of the Veterans Table sent ripples through the town. At first, there were skeptics, those who clung to the old ways and dismissed the diner's transformation as a publicity stunt. But as weeks turned into months, the diner became more than just a place to eat. It became a hub of community activity, a symbol of unity and progress. Every Friday evening, the diner hosted story nights, where veterans from different backgrounds shared their experiences. The events drew crowds of all ages, eager to listen and learn. Stories of courage, loss, and camaraderie filled the air, bridging generational and cultural divides. One particularly moving night featured a young Marine sharing his struggles with PTSD. As he spoke, an older veteran in the audience stood and walked over to him, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. The gesture sparked a standing ovation, a moment that encapsulated the spirit of the diner. The return of an old friend. One afternoon, as John was wiping down the counter, the bell above the door jingled. He looked up to see an elderly man in a wheelchair, pushed by a nurse. The man's face was thin and worn, but his sharp eyes scanned the room with keen interest. John's breath caught in his throat. "Tom Sr.," he said, setting the cloth down. The nurse wheeled the man closer, and the older Harris looked up at John, his expression unreadable. "You've done a lot with the place," he said, his voice rasping with age. John smiled faintly. Thought it was time for a change. Tom Sr. nodded slowly, his gaze drifting to the mural on the wall. His eyes lingered on the two central figures, one of them unmistakably him in his youth. His hand trembled as he raised it to point at the mural. "Is that supposed to be me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. John nodded. "It's you and me, Tom. Back when we still believed in each other." Tom Sr. closed his eyes, a tear sliding down his cheek. "I made mistakes, John. So many mistakes." "We all have," John replied gently. "But it's never too late to make things right." A community united. The diner's success wasn't limited to the town. News of the transformation reached regional and even national outlets, turning the veterans' table into a symbol of hope and reconciliation. People traveled from neighboring towns to see the diner for themselves, eager to experience the atmosphere of unity it represented. Tom Harris became a fixture at the diner, working side by side with the diverse staff. Slowly but surely, he began to earn the trust of the community. His humility and willingness to learn spoke louder than any words, and over time, even his harshest critics began to soften. A new legacy. 1 year after the diner's reopening, the town held a ceremony to commemorate its transformation. The event drew a large crowd, including state officials and veterans from across the region. John Carter stood on a makeshift stage, his voice strong as he addressed the crowd. "This diner is more than just a building," he said. "It's a testament to what we can achieve when we choose understanding over hatred, compassion over judgment, and action over complacency. Change isn't easy, but it's worth it." As the crowd erupted into applause, John looked over at Tom, who was standing near the edge of the stage. Their eyes met, and for the first time, Tom smiled. A genuine smile that reached his eyes. The veterans' table was no longer just a diner. It was a beacon of hope, a reminder that even the deepest wounds could heal with time, effort, and a willingness to embrace change. Building bridges. Tom Harris stood outside the veterans' table, staring at the vibrant mural through the diner's large front window. The once familiar building had transformed into a symbol of hope and reconciliation, yet he still felt like an outsider looking in. The hum of conversation inside was audible even through the glass, a stark contrast to the stifling silence that had once dominated the space. He adjusted the brim of his cap and took a deep breath before pushing the door open. The bell above jingled, and a few heads turned toward him. For a moment, Tom hesitated, but then he squared his shoulders and stepped inside. He wasn't the same man who had stood behind that counter months ago, clinging to outdated beliefs. He had vowed to change, and today was another step in that journey. A quiet apology. Tom approached the counter where John Carter was chatting with a group of veterans. The men laughed and exchanged stories, their camaraderie evident. When John saw Tom, his smile didn't falter, but his eyes showed curiosity. "Tom," John greeted warmly. "Good to see you. What brings you by today?" Tom hesitated, his fingers gripping the brim of his cap. I wanted to talk to you." John nodded and gestured toward an empty booth. "Let's sit." The two men settled into the booth, the murmur of conversations around them providing a comforting backdrop. Tom stared at the table for a moment, his hands fidgeting. Finally, he looked up, his eyes meeting John's. "I wanted to thank you," Tom began, his voice rough, "for not giving up on me, even when I didn't deserve it. You had every right to shut me out, to treat me the way I treated you, but you didn't." John leaned back, his expression thoughtful. "Tom, change isn't easy for anyone, but the fact that you're here, saying this, shows how far you've come." Tom nodded slowly. "I'm trying, John. I really am. But some days, it feels like no matter what I do, I'll never make up for the damage I've caused." John reached across the table, placing a hand on Tom's. "Redemption isn't about erasing the past, Tom. It's about learning from it and using what you've learned to make a better future, and you're doing that." Tom's throat tightened, and he nodded again, unable to find the words to express his gratitude. The weight that had been pressing on his chest for months felt just a little lighter. The first bridge. The veterans' table had become more than a diner. It was a community hub where people came together to share stories, ideas, and more importantly, to listen. One of the diner's regular events was Community Conversations, a weekly gathering where townsfolk discussed difficult topics in a safe, respectful environment. This week's theme was breaking down barriers. Tom had been attending these events for weeks, sitting quietly in the back, listening to others share their experiences. But tonight, something was different. He felt a need to speak. As the discussion unfolded, a young black woman named Carla shared her story about growing up in the town. She spoke about the subtle ways prejudice had shaped her childhood, from being overlooked at school to the suspicious glances she still received in certain stores. "I spent my whole life trying to prove I belong here," Carla said, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "And sometimes it feels like no matter what I do, it's never enough." Tom felt a lump rise in his throat. He glanced at John, who was seated across the room, silently encouraging him with a nod. Gathering his courage, Tom raised his hand. When the moderator called on him, Tom stood, his heart pounding. "Carla," he began, his voice shaking slightly, "I owe you, and a lot of people in this town, an apology." The room fell silent as everyone turned to look at him. Tom took a deep breath and continued. "For most of my life, I thought the way I saw the world was the right way. I thought the beliefs my father passed down to me were just, the way things were, but I see now how wrong I was. I see the pain my actions caused, not just to John Carter, but to this whole community." He looked directly at Carla, his eyes earnest. "I can't change the past, but I promise you this. I'm going to spend the rest of my life working to make this town a place where no one has to feel like they don't belong." Carla's eyes glistened with unshed tears. She nodded, and the room erupted into applause. Building a legacy together. In the weeks that followed, Tom immersed himself in the diner's mission. He worked alongside John and Michael to organize events, recruit new staff, and expand the diner's reach. Slowly, he began to earn the trust of those who had once viewed him with suspicion. One of Tom's proudest contributions was the launch of a mentorship program for young people in the community. Drawing on his years of experience running the diner, he taught teenagers practical skills like cooking, budgeting, and customer service. But more importantly, he taught them about the value of empathy and understanding. "I made a lot of mistakes," Tom would tell his mentees. "But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that we're all stronger when we work together." The program quickly became a cornerstone of the Veterans Table's mission, drawing praise from both the town and beyond. The unexpected visit. One afternoon, as Tom was wiping down tables, the bell above the door jingled. He looked up to see a familiar face, Mrs. Eleanor Jenkins. "Eleanor," he said, smiling warmly, "what brings you here?" Eleanor tapped her cane against the floor, her eyes twinkling. "I came to see what you've been up to, Tom. And I must say, I'm impressed." Tom chuckled. "I've had a lot of help." Eleanor leaned closer, her voice soft. "Your father would be proud, you know. It took him a long time to see the world clearly, but he got there in the end. And so have you." Tom's throat tightened as he nodded. "Thank you, Eleanor. That means a lot. A new chapter. As the one-year anniversary of the Veterans Table's reopening approached, the town came together to plan a celebration. The event would feature live music, speeches, and a special unveiling. A new plaque honoring the diner's mission and the people who had made it possible. On the day of the celebration, the diner was packed with people. John and Michael stood on stage, their expressions proud as they addressed the crowd. "This diner is more than just a building," Michael said. "It's a symbol of what we can achieve when we choose understanding over division and love over hate." When it was Tom's turn to speak, he hesitated for a moment before stepping up to the microphone. The crowd fell silent, waiting. "I never thought I'd be standing here," Tom began, his voice steady. "And to be honest, I'm not sure I deserve to be. But I'm grateful for this community, for the people who gave me a second chance, and for the opportunity to make things right." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "If there's one thing I've learned this past year, it's that change isn't about big dramatic gestures. It's about the small, everyday choices we make to be better, to do better, and to help each other along the way." The crowd erupted into applause, and for the first time in a long time, Tom felt truly at peace. The celebration marked a new chapter for the Veterans Table and the town as a whole. The diner continued to thrive, not just as a business, but as a beacon of hope and unity. And though there was still work to be done, the community knew that as long as they worked together, there was no challenge they couldn't overcome. A ripple effect. The glow of the Veterans Table's neon sign illuminated the bustling street outside, where a diverse crowd gathered. The atmosphere buzzed with excitement as the one-year anniversary celebration continued into the evening. The diner's transformation into a hub for unity and understanding had become the heart of the town, a shining example of what could happen when people chose to confront prejudice with hope. Inside, Tom Harris worked alongside John Carter, handing out plates of food and chatting with patrons. It was hard to believe that just a year ago, Tom had been at the center of a storm of controversy. Now, he was a symbol of redemption, his journey inspiring others to reflect on their own beliefs and behaviors. A national spotlight. As the celebration reached its peak, a film crew quietly captured the scene. The story of the Veterans Table had attracted national attention, and a major network was producing a feature about the diner and the people behind its transformation. A producer approached Tom as he cleared a table. "Mr. Harris, do you have a moment to talk on camera?" Tom hesitated, his hands gripping the edge of a tray. "Me? I don't think I'm the right person for that." John, who had been standing nearby, placed a reassuring hand on Tom's shoulder. "You are exactly the right person, Tom. Your story is part of what makes this place so powerful." Tom nodded reluctantly and followed the producer to a quiet corner. The camera operator adjusted the lighting, and the interviewer smiled warmly. "Mr. Harris," the interviewer began, "the transformation of this diner has touched hearts across the country. Can you tell us what this journey has been like for you?" Tom took a deep breath, his eyes thoughtful. "It's been humbling," he said. "I spent most of my life holding on to beliefs that I thought defined me, beliefs passed down from my father. But when I looked at the harm those beliefs caused, not just to others but to myself, I knew I had to change." He glanced toward John, who was speaking with a group of veterans. "John Carter gave me a second chance when he had every reason to write me off. That kind of grace, it's something I'll never forget." The interviewer leaned forward. "What do you hope others take away from your story?" Tom's gaze met the camera, his voice steady. "I hope people realize it's never too late to change. It's not easy, and it doesn't happen overnight. But if I can do it, anyone can. This diner is proof of what's possible when we choose understanding over hate." A surprising guest. As the interview wrapped up, the sound of a car pulling into the lot drew everyone's attention. The crowd turned to see an older man step out, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement. He adjusted his tie and smoothed his gray suit before making his way to the entrance. Whispers rippled through the crowd as people recognized him. Senator Charles Whittaker, a high-profile lawmaker known for his advocacy on civil rights and social justice. John and Michael exchanged surprised glances before stepping forward to greet him. "Senator Whittaker," John said, extending his hand. "Welcome to the veterans' table." The senator smiled warmly. "I've been hearing about this place for months. I had to see it for myself." Whittaker's presence brought a new energy to the celebration. He mingled with the crowd, speaking with veterans, community leaders, and families. Eventually, he stood on the small stage that had been set up for the evening. "This diner," Whittaker began, his voice carrying over the crowd, "is a testament to the power of community and the courage to confront difficult truths. The story of the Veterans Table isn't just about a small town. It's about what we can achieve as a nation when we come together." His words were met with applause, but Whittaker wasn't finished. "And I want to do my part to ensure this story doesn't stop here. I'm proposing a national initiative to create more spaces like this one, places where communities can come together, share their stories, and build bridges." The crowd erupted into cheers, the weight of the moment sinking in. The Veterans Table wasn't just a local success, it was becoming a model for change across the country. Healing old wounds. Later that evening, as the crowd began to thin, Tom Harris found himself standing in front of the mural. He traced the outline of the two figures at its center with his eyes, his mind drifting to his father. Tom Sr. had passed away a few months earlier, his health failing rapidly after his visit to the diner. But in his final days, he had found some measure of peace, reconnecting with John Carter and acknowledging the harm his beliefs had caused. "Dad, we've been proud of you." The voice startled Tom, and he turned to see Eleanor Jenkins standing beside him. Her cane tapped softly against the floor as she looked up at the mural. "Do you really think so?" Tom asked, his voice heavy with doubt. Eleanor nodded. "Your father made mistakes, but deep down, he wanted what was best for this town. You've carried that forward in a way he never could." Tom's eyes welled with tears. "I just wish he could have seen more of it." Eleanor placed a comforting hand on his arm. "He saw enough to know you're on the right path." A vision realized. In the months that followed, the impact of the Veterans Table continued to grow. The mentorship program expanded, offering scholarships to young people in the community. Veterans from neighboring towns began organizing their own events, inspired by the diner's success. The Senator's national initiative gained momentum, with plans for similar community hubs taking shape across the country. But perhaps the most profound change was in the town itself. Conversations that had once been avoided were now commonplace. Neighbors who had barely spoken to each other before were forming friendships. The town's annual parade, once a segregated affair, became a vibrant celebration of diversity and unity. For Tom Harris, every day was a chance to contribute to this new legacy. He worked tirelessly at the diner, not just as an employee but as a mentor and a bridge builder. And while he knew he could never undo the mistakes of his past, he took comfort in knowing he was part of something larger than himself. A quiet reflection. One evening, after the diner had closed, John and Tom sat together at a booth, nursing cups of coffee. The room was quiet, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound. "You've done a lot, Tom," John said, breaking the silence. "So have you," Tom replied. "None of this would have happened without you." John smiled faintly, his gaze drifting to the mural. "You know, when all this started, I didn't think it would lead here. I just wanted to stand up for what was right." "And you did," Tom said. "You showed me there was another way." They sat in companionable silence for a while, each lost in their thoughts. Finally, John spoke again. "Do you think this will last?" Tom's expression grew serious. "I think it will, as long as we keep working at it. Change doesn't happen in a day, but it starts with moments like this." John nodded, his eyes glinting with quiet determination. "Then we'll keep working." As they clinked their coffee mugs together, the neon sign outside flickered gently, casting its warm glow onto the street. The Veterans Table stood as a beacon of hope, a reminder that even in the face of division, unity was always within reach. The ripple effect had begun, and it was only the beginning.